everybody, and thanks for joining us for our webinar this morning. My name is Jesse Cole. I am the president of Interlutions, and Interlutions is a QSO, a credit union service organization owned by Corporate Central, and we recently formed a really exciting partnership with a company called SRM, Strategic Resource Management, and this was really at the request of several members of Corporate Central to assist in the process of negotiating more favorable contracts for credit unions. I think we can all agree that, especially in the card processing space, these contracts can be difficult to manage, can be very expensive and very complex. And we really found an exciting consultative expert in the card processing field that's really helped a lot of our members out. So we're excited to bring some education along with this program to our members of the credit union and the QSO. And I want to introduce our key contact over at Strategic Resource Management, Uma Zielinski, who will be hosting the webinar for us. A couple quick things before we get started. We do have the lines muted. However, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in. There's a Q&A and a chat feature. You can type in some questions, and we'll be happy to answer those either throughout the next 30 minutes or towards the end of the webinar. So again, thanks for joining us, and I will kick controls over here to Uma.
Well, terrific, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and looking forward to taking a few minutes this morning to share with you how to level the playing field with those vendor relationships to really be able to maximize the results that you can deliver to your credit union and to your members. And so what we're going to do is take a few minutes this morning just to talk about why this is important and what is the value that you can drive to your specific organization by taking a focus in terms of some of these key vendor contracts and really ensuring that they're aligned to be in your best interest and not just in the best interest of your vendors. And so we're going to start by talking about a few basic truths to vendor contracts. One of those first basic truths is that vendors negotiate contracts for a living. So when you think about what you and your team does in negotiating a Visa or MasterCard agreement or a card processing agreement or your core agreement, those are agreements that typically come up every 5, 7, and 10 years. And I think it's really important to be mindful to know that the difference is that your vendors are negotiating those agreements on a daily basis, not only with your peer credit unions, but with financial institutions all across the country. And while you're negotiating that contract, again, once every several years, they are negotiating very easily 50 to 100 contracts per account manager. And so oftentimes what we find is that these contracts are really slated in the favor of your vendor and not necessarily always aligned to what's in the best interest of the credit union. So it's really important as you look at some of your key vendor agreements, especially those that have a master agreement along with sub-agreements, that there's a lot of moving pieces and parts that can be impacted by simply looking at one aspect. So for example, you sign off on bill pay with your core, not realizing that what that does is it extends the full term of any and all services that you have with that particular vendor for another 3 or 5 or 7 year period. So just a lot of nuances that it's really helpful to be aware of to, again, simply protect yourself and your interests. Basic truth number 3 is that vendors have information and information is power. How do you, again, get the power so that it benefits the credit union, so that you understand how vendors price in some of these key contracts? And is your credit union taking a data-driven approach to your vendor contract renewals? And so what we're going to do is share some elements of how you can be again, really on the same level playing field with your vendor contracts so that you are optimizing your results. This is a really favorite particular quote of mine from a financial institution, and it's not uncommon for us to hear. We feel really good about our team's ability to negotiate, and I am absolutely certain that that is true. What's important is that are you negotiating to get market price, very specific to your credit union based on your size and scope. And we'll talk about some ways that you can help validate various components and pieces so that you're not leaving a 5, 6, or potentially 7-figure opportunity on the table. And so making contract negotiation a priority is absolutely key. And I know that's a very hard thing to do. If you think about your own credit union and you think about how your resources are stretched so thin, everyone's wearing a lot of hats. We know that regulatory pressures continue to take up more of your time and more of your resources. And often what we find is that most credit unions simply don't have the ability to have a dedicated procurement team. So you as a CEO may take care of your Visa and MasterCard relationship. Your CFO might be managing your card processing relationship. You might have someone else on your team taking a look at some of those branch type of contracts like your ATMs and armored car. And so typically what we see is that these duties and functions are spread out throughout your organization, and it does make it a little bit more difficult to, again, manage the process and leverage your negotiations so that you're not sacrificing to your P&L and the results that you can drive. On top of that, we know that the banking climate is rapidly changing at quite honestly, a very accelerated pace. And there's so many game changers to be mindful of. It makes it that much more important and difficult to be a specialist in every area. We know that you all manage anywhere between 50 and 100 contracts. So when your team has to support that many different types of vendor relationships and vendor negotiations, it makes it really difficult to stay on top of all of the rapidly changing pieces in technology. For example, mobile banking, core internet banking, looking at your PIN POS networks, what's going on in the P2P or the card processing space. When you add on top of that, how much time your team spends now on fraud between breaches and check fraud and debit and credit card fraud, it becomes very, very difficult to, again, be able to feel like you can be a specialist in each and every area to not only drive the right price points for your credit union, but make sure that the technology contracts that you're entering into not only meet your strategic goals and objectives, but are delivering the member experience that you seek to deliver to them. And so it's really important then to understand the how and when inside of some of these agreements. And so what we're going to do is talk about a few best practices, a few areas that you and your team can try to focus on to elevate your results inside of your contract renewals and really be able to feel that you are delivering the very best that you can, again, as you renegotiate your agreements. And so one of the key ones I always like to talk about is the power of the auto renew clause. And again, we know that you and your team manage so many agreements. Almost every single vendor contract today now has an auto renewal clause. And if you don't give the proper notification, your contract will automatically renew for another time period. And oftentimes what we're seeing as a trend today is that those contracts aren't just renewing for another 12 or 24 months. They're often renewing for the same time period of your original agreement, which means you could be locked in for another 5 years at your current rates. What are the implications of that happening to your credit union? Well, if you think about it, again, in some key areas like mobile banking, internet banking, your card processing, your networks, there are not only the financial implications of paying too much because pricing has been driven down in an area like mobile, for example, as more vendors come to the table and as there's more options available to credit unions, that has driven down the price that you should be paying to your providers. And so allowing that contract to either auto renew or simply extending that contract without doing more due diligence will keep you at an inflated rate instead of at market price today. Not only are there financial implications, but there's also the implication of service and support. And are you getting locked in at, again, another 3, 4, or 5 year commitment where that particular vendor or that solution really doesn't meet what your strategic goals were or the service features and functionality that you had hoped to deliver to your members? One of the great takeaways that I like to share with credit unions and with my clients is to give that notice right when you sign that new agreement. And what that does is absolutely level the playing field for you. By giving that notice right out of the gate, the vendor knows that you have every opportunity to test the market, to evaluate your options without getting locked into an auto renewal. Another best practice is simply to invest in vendor management tools. And there's so many tools available out there, either through Corporate Central or a variety of vendors who are offering vendor management so that you can keep track of these contract expirations, not have your staff bogged down by a manual process. If you're still using spreadsheets and Excel files today to keep track of those auto renewals and when that next contract expiration is, I would highly recommend that you look into some alternative options. And so let's talk a little bit about some of those key vendor contracts and the power of your incumbent. We all know that nobody wants to go through a conversion, and your vendor knows that too. They understand that your resources are limited. They understand that you have the fear of the unknown in bringing on a new vendor, and they know that you do not want to put your members through any type of disruption. And because of all of those elements, your incumbent vendor does carry a lot of power. And so being able to give that auto renewal is really important. Starting your renewal process in a time frame that allows you to test the market or give the impression that you're going to test the market, again, gives you that opportunity to have some of that power and control back. And it's really important to keep it professional. I can't tell you how many times I hear from a client that a particular vendor has been a really good partner of theirs. And that's absolutely great. We all want good partners. Part of being a good partner is also delivering market price to you and not having you pay too much. So it's really important to be able to have that separation, to also keep it professional so that you're not leaving money on the table. And so one of the ways that you can win without switching vendors and without having to contemplate a conversion for the sake of simply driving a better price point is to start that renewal process 24 months in advance, no less than 12 months in advance. I have a credit union I'm working with, for example, in the Carolinas. They're about $1 billion credit union. Their card processing agreement is up in December. And before I started chatting with them, they weren't expecting to start that renewal process until the fall timeframe. When you give yourself only 90 days to try to renew a new price contract, especially one as significant as your card processing, what you've done is really limited the amount of ability that you have to price optimize and to ensure that you're at market price. And again, we're not saying that you have to go into a renewal being adversarial. Simply by starting 12 to 24 months in advance and giving that do not roll letter so that your vendor knows that you're considering your options, those pieces alone will drive a 10 to 20% improvement in your pricing. Another thing to keep in mind, and you're either likely going through it yourself or you have a peer credit union going through it, is that as we continue to see mergers and acquisitions, and every year they seem to become more significant and more meaningful, what that means is that the landscape continues to change. There's fewer financial institutions for that vendor to work with year over year. That makes your contract that much more valuable. Whether you're 200 million in assets or 2 billion in assets, your contract is important to that vendor, and you have a right to want to optimize that agreement from a pricing perspective, from a service level perspective, to be able to drive, again, the very best that you can to your organization. What's really neat about some of these strategies is that we're not talking about switching vendors. If your vendor is doing a really great job for you, it's simply doing your due diligence and getting that price optimization. When we are engaged and working with a client, over 90% of the time, our clients stay with the incumbent. And so we're able to help them to effectively drive a better price and also not worry about putting their resources at risk, disrupting the member experience, or having to stage for a conversion. Now, I will say that all to say, if you have key areas where you're dissatisfied with your service levels, or there are some disruptors and you do want to test the market, that makes it even more critical to start 24 months in advance. And so $1 here and $1 there really does equal a significant difference to your bottom line. There's a lot of key elements in certain vendor agreements that really need to be looked at to ensure that you are priced, again, according to what market is today. So for example, when you look at areas like your core or your bill pay, do you have tiered pricing? Should you have tiered pricing? Does your pricing today accommodate for growth? Does it accommodate for the cost to deconvert? Does it accommodate for termination? Are those things that you are being planful about and taking the time to negotiate inside of that agreement prior to signing a new renewal, so that if you do have an acquisition 2 years into a 5-year agreement, you're already well staged or poised to be able to reap the benefits of that acquisition and your new size. And so a lot of different elements that we can help you take a look at and go through. So again, to make sure that you're not leaving any money on the table. And so timing is really, really important when you think about when to get started. As I mentioned, when you think about leverage and who has the leverage today, when you are in an auto renewal, absolutely the vendor has the leverage. There have been many times where we get engaged to look at a very key contract like a card processing or a core processing. And what the credit union finds out after we get things started is that they missed giving that renewal. And now, again, they're locked in for an extended period at rates that are absolutely not favorable for their credit union. Again, I've had scenarios where a credit union will start that renewal process 3 to 6 months in advance. When you're only starting 3 to 6 months in advance, your vendor still has the leverage. And again, I came from the vendor side. So prior to joining SRM 3 years ago, I spent 15 years as a vendor working and calling on banks and credit unions. And I knew if a client didn't start negotiating with me until 3 or 6 months prior to that expiration, I knew I didn't have to deliver the very best price point. I knew that I was going to get the renewal because, quite honestly, they didn't have enough time to test the market, get a quote from a competitor. And so it really allowed me to improve the profitability to my organization because I didn't have to deliver the very best in pricing to that particular financial institution. Where you start to really level the playing field is when you start that renewal process at least 12 months in advance. And I would say the contracts that fall under this scenario are more typically those related to your branch network. So contracts such as ATM, armored car, consumer checks, those vendors are not going to start a renewal with you very likely until you're in that window of around 12 months from expiration. Now, what we find is that for your larger agreements, areas like your online banking, your PIN POS networks, your bill pay, you'll want to start those 18 months in advance. And then your real key ones like your core processing, your Visa MasterCard relationships, and your card processing, that is where you want to start them no less than 24 months in advance. You want to have adequate runway to get competitive bids, or at least give the opportunity to decide, is that something that you and your team may have some interest in, but it gives you that runway to negotiate the very best in price. And so one other tip that I will leave you with is to really take advantage of all of the tools that are available to you. So for example, when we talk about looking at third-party contracts, take a look at vendor management software so that you're not missing auto renewal. Take a look at using a service like SRM and the CU Safe program so that you're getting the data analytics and the benchmarks that are really going to drive what is the right price for my specific size organization, and then take the time to get the legal review so that you aren't getting stuck with any gotchas inside of those agreements. Again, those agreements are written by the attorneys of your vendors, and so have your attorney take a look at it for things like service levels and for other gotchas that can very potentially easily be either remedied or addressed or at least amended to before you sign on to another term. And so with that said, I'm going to take a quick pause here and see what questions we might have.
Thank you, Uma. Thanks for the insight and a lot of really great tips. We do have a question that was typed in here. I'll read that off for you. Has it been difficult to maintain long-term positive relationships with vendors when negotiating lower cost contracts?
Yeah, and that's a really great question. And so absolutely not. When we are engaged and we're working with a client, we value that vendor relationship. And again, our role is not adversarial. The very first step is simply to validate, are you at market price? And so when you use a service like ours, what we're simply helping you do is conduct that internal audit or assessment. So we don't put your vendors on notice. We're simply helping you do that due diligence to see, is there even an opportunity to price optimize? Are there some gaps between your contracted price and what market price is? Now, 90% of the time we do uncover gaps. The second step is to help you implement. And that's where you have a lot of flexibility in determining, do you want to lead those renewals where we're assisting you behind the scenes? Would you like us to lead that renewal? And oftentimes clients do have us lead. We can simply help you cut to the chase because your vendors know we're only asking for the price that fits your specific size and scope. They know we have the data and benchmarks because we've worked with over 700 financial institutions coast to coast. And so we're not asking for anything but market share or market price specific to your size credit union.
Thank you, Uma. Great information. So I guess I'll just make one other comment. Again, this is Jesse over at Interlutions and Corporate Central. Uma spent some time talking about the data and the benchmarks, and that is an area that I've seen firsthand. Uma coming in to work with several credit unions and in providing the benchmarks. It's for credit unions, it's been so difficult to understand what is the right pricing, what's competitive from a per item fee and a signing bonus amount and offer, and having that data and the benchmarks really comes into, again, level that playing field and put the credit union at an advantage. So we have several case studies that we can certainly share with credit unions if you're interested on that side of it. But those were the questions typed in as well. Uma, I want to thank you again so much for joining us and for the insight. If anyone has any specific questions or needs copies of the slides, feel free to reach out either to Uma. Her contact information is included here, or myself, again, Jesse and the team at Corporate Central Credit Union. So with that said, I want to thank everyone for joining us and have a great rest of your day.